Hello again, Register audience. Welcome back. It only seems like yesterday we were here broadcasting live because it was yesterday. But we got something special for you today. We're building a DevOps culture. We know that you're very interested in this. We get a lot of requests about it. When we go out, we have a lot of people are talking about this. But what actually does it mean? Practically, how do you do it? It's bound to be more difficult than it seems. Well, it is. That's what we're going to find out. But it doesn't mean you can't do it, and it doesn't mean there aren't very good reasons to do it. We're going to find out about all of that today. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, the idea is that DevOps it's more than just about a process. It's more than just about the simple goal. And we need some people who are experienced in DevOps to tell you a little bit about that. So who've we got? Well, we've got one of the best experts that we could possibly find for you. Ashok, welcome to the studio today.
Thank you very much, Tim. Glad to be here.
Now, IBM is really big into DevOps, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I think we actually are going through a big transformation within IBM, and I'm responsible for the DevOps strategy and the portfolio within IBM.
No pressure then, yeah, in that case. Now, Dale, this is something also you spend a lot of time working on as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is a really good webcast actually, because we talk about a lot of stuff here, but this is one of those topics that whenever I introduce it to people, they're really into it straight away. It's one of those things that everyone struggles with, everyone sees a need for, but a lot of people are not quite sure how to go about doing it. So we can talk about all kinds of other things, and people are kind of, well, I'm not quite sure, I don't see the point of it. But with this, there's kind of universal acceptance. This is a good thing to be aiming for.
Yeah, we've got questions in already about that. So already, for example, and the really fundamental basic things about this. For instance, Mike Strefford's question, how do you build and support the culture that's key to driving success in a DevOps environment? Well, how do you?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about some of this in detail, obviously, but there are some formal bits. There's some process that you need in place. There's some tooling that helps to do it. But then there's a lot of sort of informal pieces, just to break down some of the traditional barriers between the various groups that have traditionally worked, separately. So we'll get into some of that stuff, but it is, this is a multifaceted animal here that we're talking about. So you need to kind of look at it from lots of different directions.
Yeah, and Ashok, it seems to be something that's very easy. A culture like this is very easy to build badly, I would imagine.
No, absolutely. I think one of the things is to really get the different groups to agree upon a common goal and outcome. So I think what happens is then everybody wants to deliver software quickly, for example, get the users happy. So to me, getting an agreement around a common goal is one of the ways to address the silos and the gaps between the organization.
Lovely. And so we've got a lot of material to get through. It's a very practical session we're going on today. You should be a lot further on down the road to helping to build your DevOps culture. If we are successful today, I'm sure we will be. These guys are really good at it. Please do ask questions. If like Mike, you've got a general question or a very specific one from something that comes up, let us know. It comes in on the screen here. I ask these guys to give you an answer. That's how it works. So we'll do the best we can to answer all of your questions about DevOps culture. But first of all, Dale, I guess what we need to do is look at your research here. Why is it needed?
Yeah, well, I don't think this is going to be news to anyone. This just comes through in pretty much every survey we do now when we look at the sort of business context for IT delivery. And we spent a lot of time over the last decade or so talking about costs and cost management and cost cutting. And that's really important. It remains important to lots of organisations. But what's been coming up more and more and more is we need to be able to move a lot more quickly than we have done traditionally. So delivering new stuff quickly, making changes, rolling out new functionality, and just getting IT off the critical path to getting things done from a business perspective. And that comes through. This chart shows we got pretty much agreement on the customer side, which is the left-hand side. That's what
they want from IT, yeah.
And IT guys sort of understand this. So we're all kind of aligned, and that's what I was saying earlier. Everyone appreciates that this is such a key issue in IT now, just speeding up delivery and getting it more agile.
The trouble is already people are starting to use DevOps as a vague way of saying let's do things quickly. It's not quite as simple as that, though.
No, it's not. There's a lot of discipline that we'll get onto.
Well, let's quickly get onto that then and find out exactly what DevOps is, Ashok. So the DevOps approach, what is it?
I think it's a very good question, right? I think the simple answer is, to me, it's about applying lean principles, just like we have applied lean in the manufacturing. It's about how do I actually get the applications and software into production or in the hands of the users, let them actually use it and give feedback. So that whole notion of feedback loop is very important, and being able to get the software in the hands of the users. And applying lean principles also to look at what are the things what people are doing where there's overhead or waste in the process. So the way we also look at that is really the waste is those things which are not spent in terms of understanding what we users need or customers need. So you want to focus all your activities on those things which you're learning from the actual customers or users. So to me, DevOps is really about that, applying lean principles in a way you can get feedback, faster feedback loop.
The point you were making, Dale, is that in the past, software development was all about let's give a lump of software, it goes to the users. If they got some things they want to do about it, then it's a little bit too late at that point.
Well, it is, but there's actually something a bit more fundamental than that, and that's that we've, a lot of the way in which people approach development is rooted in the old world, where basically you rolled out a piece of software, generally internally to your employees, and your employees had to use it. And if it wasn't quite optimal, then that was tough. They needed to get on with it.
They needed to get used to the software.
So, you go back to the old waterfall technologies that have been around for decades. That's where this comes from. Nowadays, if you think of the extreme, if you're talking about a consumer, your customers that are accessing an application through your website, those guys have a choice. They don't have to use your software. It's up to them. So we're getting into this world of sort of elective applications. And so if you deploy something and the user doesn't respond well to it, or they use it differently to how you expected, you need to be able to spot that very, very quickly and do something about it.
Before it's finished.
Exactly.
Build to that. Yes.
Well, and even when it's live, and the whole point we're going to be coming on to this, and this is the reason why we need to connect dev and ops, because in the live environment, we need to pick that up and be able to rapidly go around the loop again. And it's probably worth mentioning as well, it's not just about externally facing applications, it's also about internal applications. So people are rolling out these kind of elective applications to their workforce now. They want them to be used, but people don't necessarily have to use them. So all the same principles apply. You need to monitor how software is being used internally and rapidly change things when needed to meet the business objective.
This has broken a whole load of things that we're going to have to get through, doesn't it? This is by no means straightforward. Obviously, we can see it originally. Now, you're saying there's 3 dimensions here, Ashok.
I think it's very important to understand that. I think one of the things with DevOps is it's not just about getting how to get Dev and Ops to work together. It's really the focus is about the outcomes we are trying to achieve. It's really about a business challenge we're trying to address. How do I get an idea into the market as quickly as possible with built-in feedback loop? So the 3 key dimensions are, the first one is, of course, the speed of delivery, which is time to value or the time to market. Then the second one is you want to deliver rapidly, but at the same time, you also want to make sure the quality and security and other aspects, regulations which customers care about is also addressed. So speed with balanced quality. And the third key aspect is it's not just about getting software out on time and budget, but it's also how do I reduce the amount of time it takes to get feedback from the actual users. So to some extent, I think these are the 3 aspects. But also DevOps, you can think about it as it really has these 4 different phases, which is really we talk about steer, develop and test, and deploy and operate. So in that context, there are a set of practices. One is around how do I actually create an idea? How do I actually define what I'm going to develop and who are the customers? And then how do I actually collaborate across the entire company and my supply chain and be able to develop it? And then how do I actually test it, and how do I deploy so that the customers and users are able to use it and give you feedback? And then how do I actually monitor that on an ongoing basis so that I can get that feedback loop built in? So really DevOps is this whole notion of it's a capability from enterprise's perspective to be able to rapidly deliver software and also have the feedback loop built in with a set of practices which people can adopt.
So it just goes a long way, because some people say, well, you're just finding a way of repackaging Agile and giving it a new name. What you're saying goes a long way beyond that.
No, absolutely. I think it's Agile is actually it's not just about development. So DevOps to me is going beyond development, right? If development is the only part of the organization which is Agile, what about the operations who have to kind of take the software and be able to operate that? Or whatever the line of business, they have to plan, and you have to have marketing, sales, support. Everybody has to be part of it. So really, in a simple way, it's about agility beyond development. And it needs to be from end to end, all the way from getting an idea to how do I actually introduce that into the market.
It's one of the questions we got in Ninig Key was saying one of the questions you get is how you build a team end to end, and this is really where we're going to spend our time today, isn't it? We're going to look at the management challenge of how you make the process work more than any particular technical thing.
Right, exactly. I think we will basically talk about that in terms of how we actually, what are the things, what happens throughout the delivery of a life cycle, and then what are the different groups involved. How do you enable that collaboration and be able to deliver that continuously with a feedback loop? So we'll get into the details.
And there's one other quick thing I want to ask about is how mature is this as a process, as a way of generating value? Is this something that's still being experimented with, or can we be pretty sure that there's a right and a wrong way to do it?
Well, I think it's, these practices have been now, we have been doing that in IBM for a couple of years now. We have got some feedback from customers where we surveyed, which we'll talk a little bit later. But it's really, there are customers, quite a few enterprise clients who have adopted this and been successfully delivering software in this manner. So definitely it's getting more maturity, and that's why you see increased adoption of the DevOps approach among many of our clients.
Great. Okay, so let's have a look. So let's have a look at why we're doing it now, why DevOps seems to have sort of taken over the conversation suddenly.
Well, I think it's really one of the things what we are seeing is how software has become so important, right? There's always been data has been important, but if you think about what's happening with all the innovation, regardless of the industry, whether it's an automobile, you get millions of lines of code, and most of the innovation is coming through software. Same thing is happening in Internet of Things. And if you look at banks, every industry is adopting software to innovate. So in that context, things are changing rapidly, and you have also developers who are becoming increasingly empowered in terms of being able to deliver. So how do you make it easy for them to have self-service, and so they can focus on innovation? So I think all this are really driving the DevOps, and so it's not really an option many of our clients have, and it's really market-driven. And the second aspect is really the technology aspects. So, mobile, for example, right? You have big data, things which are changing rapidly. So every other week we get an update from Apple or Android updates. So the applications what we have built need to work on what we call a zero-day release. Customers don't, go ask Apple, why did you release that? But it's more, is my banking application, is it working or is it breaking? So all of us found that it's not an option. You have, because of the technology and all the changes, rapid changes, DevOps is almost a necessity for clients.
And a lot of the cloud and mobile players actually are setting the agenda, to be honest, because they're changing expectations of all of us. I mean, we just all get used to things being there when we need them, and things coming through the line in terms of new stuff to do, new things to take advantage of, to use. And there's no going back. I mean, going back to the old days of clunky, releases every few months is just not acceptable in lots of scenarios now.
It's one of those things where we've woken up and realised that the world's changed around us.
Yeah.
Yes. You just have to get used to it.
And this is about the whole IT delivery side of things catching up with that, I think.
Yes. Good. Well, let's in which case let's have a look now. We have to speed up software delivery, but as we were saying, Agile itself can't get us there.
Yes, I think it's one of the things with, when we look at, we actually did a survey recently across 600 clients, both in US and Europe, and to just understand where customers are in terms of this sort of approach of DevOps and how people are delivering. So one thing we found is both many of the clients, were using either waterfall approach or just Agile in the development. They're not able to get to this much more rapid delivery of like 2 to 3 weeks, for example. I think there is a set of practices which they seem to adopt. The ones who have made this leap, it's not just incremental 10% type improvements, it's almost like 10 times of an improvement, right? So you have to adopt certain practices which enables you to go from, you can go all the way to maybe 1 year delivery to 6 months to a few months. But in order to get to really continuous delivery, 1 to 2 weeks to 3 weeks or even daily releases, there are some of the DevOps practices seem to be what's working for many of these clients who have made the leap.
And to actually make this leap requires a certain amount of leadership, isn't it? It's not something that can just bubble up from below.
No, absolutely. I think you need a commitment from top down as well as the people who are doing this, because it is organizational transformation to some extent, and it's cultural change. It's not just about how do I make something every 2 weeks, but if you have to deliver software, the customers have to be able to consume it. You'll have to have your support team be able to support it, and there is a change across the entire organization. So you do need say senior management support as well as the bottom up practitioner support to make this happen.
We're going to go into some of the items of it.
And on that, it isn't just a memo from the chief exec saying this is really important. You have to actually change the metrics. What is it that people are measured on? Ops guys quite often are focused on purely on service levels. Keeping systems running, which is why they resist anything that's going to disrupt that and mean that they're not going to meet their targets in terms of uptime or availability or whatever. We need to change that. It's not that we put service level to one side, but we need to get the ops guys driven as much by business outcomes, as Ashok said.
So one of the things you often say about DevOps is that it's all dev when some people talk about it, and they kind of ignore the ops guys.
It is. So you need to get everyone sort of aiming towards the business objective, not their own parochial kind of measures that might pay their bonuses or get them pats on the back.
I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? You're incentivized along that, and suddenly you have this increased request for service from dev, and it's like, now there also needs a certain amount of rigor, doesn't it? And actually, this brings in a couple of the questions here. There's one question saying that it's really very hard to end up getting thwarted by the accountants in the client organisation. How do I get this approach accepted by the customer? By the customer, he means the people who are going to sign off the check for them to be able to do it. And it becomes something that you can be suspicious of, that this is going to suck up an enormous amount of resource within the organisation for what may or may not be a definable benefit at the end of it. Ashok, you must come up against this resistance all the time.
I think so. I think generally what happens is that when people adopt DevOps, it's not just the practitioners, right? The actual benefit is are our users getting the value what they need. So from a business perspective, one of the things what people need to show is that really it's about, at the end of the day, not releasing software just on time and budget, but it's about, am I delivering value? Am I getting more customers signing up? So you can start looking at metrics such as, am I getting more users? And when you do this continuously, you're able to look at that. You can actually experiment more easily what works, So that's, I think, is one of the advantages of DevOps is it enables management and business to experiment much more easily and learn from it, or what we call a fail-fast approach.
A fail-fast approach, but you have to be able to quantify success and failure along a slightly different axis than you were.
And you've got to break some old habits. I mean, one of the things we come across is that the way in which you account for IT internally quite often doesn't lend itself well to this kind of approach. I mean, we touched on this before. In a world, if you just talk about an agile data center environment, you can no longer tie a server to a cost center, because that server might be doing something different this afternoon than it was this morning. And so, we're coming from a world where IT has been budgeted and costed based on an old silo-based approach to developing stuff, and it's the same with projects. We've got used to project budgets. And putting a budget in place that assumes that you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a delivery, and that's going to have a certain cost. So, I mean, here we're talking about a much more continuous approach to delivering value.
But there has to be some
business.
Defined goal. There has to be something that's a sort of an end of the beginning almost. Ashok, we have to be reaching something, and not going round and round and round all the time.
No, absolutely. I think there is a saying about agile. It's almost like a washing machine, and people develop software and it's spinning and spinning. You don't know when to pull out.
Waiting for it to finish.
But I think in this approach of DevOps, what happens is you're actually getting feedback from the users. And when users are satisfied with something, and where you can actually get that where you can ship
that
something.
Can be a goal when you've
reached. That could be a goal. Number of users you climb, or maybe there are some outcomes like reducing the amount of time it takes to ship software. So you could set some things as specific goals to determine when to stop and when to ship.
Yes, great. Now, you've got this approach called the shift left approach. Explain that to us.
Well, I think one of the things Dale talked about is its importance of, it's not, DevOps is not just about development to some extent. It's all about how do I actually get, one of the breakage points in DevOps is really what people develop and test is different than what operations, when it actually gets deployed. So how do you actually solve that problem? And shift left is about how do I shift things left, before. In Agile, you develop software, the development teams are doing the testing. but can we enable them to, for example, develop and test in a production-like environment, working collaboratively with operations, defining things where they can bring that into test environments and they can actually test it and monitor it in a production-like environment. So what you're doing is you're shifting the quality aspects. Instead of shipping something and then the users finding out the defects and then getting the feedback, you're able to get that done in the process of the developers developing it. It's in context, and that means you're building quality into the process. So the shift left is very important to bring that notion of operations and users' feedback into the development teams when they're actually developing it.
Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to draw this curve explicitly, isn't it? To measure it explicitly. The things that are on the axis, time you can measure, risk exposure is somewhat subjective. So it's important to be able to measure something that you can say we have shifted left.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, it's about quality by design, right? It's sort of what you can say is the cost of a defect when you find it. If like an automobile manufacturer, when they ship something and if you have to recall, you're literally recalling hundreds of thousands of cars, for example. It's software defects nowadays. But it's really the cost of shift left is really about the sooner I find a defect, right, it's a lot easier to fix and it's a lot less costlier. So to me, I think we have a lot of studies which have been done that the shift left approach allows you to find defects sooner. And also, it's more than just the defects, it's also about getting feedback sooner. So what we can do in the context of cloud and others is you can expose part of your software to a certain small set of users and get feedback from them. So I think in that case, I think you are able to validate what your user experience is going to be, as well as you've shifted the quality and the testing aspects much earlier in the life cycle.
So what we've come out with this short conversation we've been able to have about what it actually is one of the really important things is defining an outcome. It's, yes, getting that feedback, acting on that feedback quickly to reduce, like you say, to reduce defects, to act on what the users want, but also to define an outcome that is acceptable, that is what you want, that is aspirational.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also the risk. Risk is really defined, right? The quality is the amount of risk you're willing to take. Yeah. So, how much testing you do, how much feedback you want to get. So the sooner you're able to address it, you're actually taking less risk. So that's why it's important to have the shift left approach.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have, yes, for actually, Ian, for example, is asking about things that you can do to sell DevOps to the business. Well, that's, he asked for 3. We're given a really important one here, which is you'll get better stuff quicker than you would before. We'll go into some more of the things that you can do to make it convincing later on. But first of all, what we've really got to do is to look at exactly how you do it, practically how you do it. Now, you've isolated this down to 8 key practices, which are, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of what DevOps is for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things what we kind of looked at is it's not when we looked at those clients that I talked about a survey we did, as well as some of the experience we have had with clients. Looking at for those clients who are delivering software rapidly, but also with quality and who have adopted this shift left, what are the type of practices they have implemented within their companies?
So this is based on successful shift lefters.
Yes.
Good DevOps practice so far. This is it.
Speed with quality.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's not just delivering something rapidly, but also how do I make sure that quality and reducing the risk. Mm-hmm. So what we found is these 8 practices are the ones what most of these successful clients have adopted. The first one is what we call a minimum viable product, which is really about you don't wait to build everything 100% what you want to do versus focusing on what's the smallest product or application you can build in order to get it in the hands of the users and get that feedback loop, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the first practice that we find common across many of these clients. So that way they're not shipping every 12 months and building everything, because if you don't even know how it's going to work with the users, it'll fail.
Is there a temptation towards product creep to actually say, let's just put a bit more and more in this?
Absolutely. I think, how do you define, because until you actually have the users, because we all tend to do this, we keep adding more things, and the longer it takes, now there are maybe some environments have changed and now you're redoing things. So it's really, you'll have to focus on what is that minimum viable product and being able to get that feedback sooner.
Good.
And then the second aspect is really people also, you need to have smaller teams, smaller dedicated teams. I think we find that the larger the teams, the overhead is bigger, and if they're distributed and other things also, it adds more. But it's having dedicated, focused, small teams seem to be another practice, what we have found.
So this isn't something that you just give to people to do in their spare time or in sort of half an hour at the end of the day. You put them onto a DevOps team.
Absolutely. I think they just need to be focused on the outcomes they're trying to achieve, and given the nature of continuous delivery, they'll be getting feedback, and they don't have to wait, obviously, from testing and getting feedback. So that needs dedication, and be able to also have a smaller team, because the communications and the whole thing with operations and others, it becomes easier.
Okay. What's this loosely coupled architecture then?
Well, I think one of the things what we find is that most of the IT clients have many applications, and these tend to have dependencies on each other. So in order to really deliver things rapidly and continuously, one of the key practices is making it loosely coupled. So that way you don't have hard dependencies on different applications and the components. So it's easy to, for example, just update a particular component if you want to do it every 2 weeks, versus depending on every application related has to be updated. So building it in a loosely coupled way is one of the key practice we have found.
A few years ago, we might have called that SOA. And I mean, just to connect the dots.
We used to do Regcast.
We used to do Regcast on SOA, didn't we? Just to connect the dots, I mean, there's a phrase going around at the moment, which is the API economy and the API-driven business. And really, we're talking about the same kind of core principles, which is building reusable components that publish interfaces that other components can consume, and having that loose coupling gives you a lot of flexibility, because it means that you can change the innards of this component completely, and it's not actually going to affect anything else, but provided you don't disrupt the interfaces.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Okay. Minimizing handoffs.
Well, I think taking this manufacturing approach is really about when you have different teams working on it. So you want to avoid the number of handoffs. So, for example, development develops software, and if the testers are waiting for the developers to hand it to them, or testing team is waiting for the operations to set up a test environment. So to me, I think it's sort of looking at what are the different things which are happening. So how do you actually make it self-service? How can you look at minimize the number of handoffs? So eliminating that waste in the process is one of the key practice.
You need clean handoffs as well, don't you?
Absolutely.
You need that to be done with a certain amount of discipline.
Yes.
Yeah, and to your point that we quite often come at this from a development standpoint to begin with. We've had a lot of these discussions in the operations world before about breaking down some of these barriers and minimizing handoffs between the storage guys and the security guys and the server guys and the application guys, for instance. So this isn't a new discussion even within operations. What we're doing is saying we just need to broaden it out and bridge that gap now, apply that same kind of thinking across the traditional DevOps divide.
Yes. Now, we've got a couple of questions in that I'm holding on to because they're relevant to things later on, so we haven't forgotten you. But also, as we're going through this, if you have been involved in DevOps projects, and we know they don't always go as smoothly as Ashok's do, and then you've run into problems. Let us know about how you coped with that, or even if you haven't, ask us how you think our studio experts would cope with it, then, and that will be useful for us as well as hopefully useful for you. Delivering in small batches.
Yeah, I think it's another one which I think is important, because what we find is that breaking things into smaller incremental deliveries and smaller batches is a key principle. It's a lean approach. And so when we try to do a big bang and end-to-end type things, things tend to fail, and also you don't have an easy way to get feedback on those things. So I think it's one of the key aspects is to how do I break into smaller amounts and deliver those things and be able to get the feedback on those things.
Transparency, that's not obvious to me what that is at all.
Well, I think it's, when we look at DevOps, I said it's about, everybody involved from line of business to development to operations. It's really when you have transparency across. So if development teams knows what's the production environment working with operations, or operations, to Dale's point, if they don't know what development is going to be delivering. So having the transparency where each one knows where they are and what's going on in the process, and that it will help everybody to do their jobs better. So the shift left, for example, developers can understand what are the type of things operations are going through, or what's the production like environment, because sometimes when a patch comes out for an operating system, production operations, they may update that. But having the transparency will allow people to focus on what it is they need to do, versus kind of blaming each other because development did something and they're delivering me something I can't deploy. Our operations will have the challenge in terms of they're to do all these updates, but how do they share what they have found with the development or development with the line of business? So the transparency is really by better understanding. We found that the product developers who are very productive are those who understand end to end how it's actually used, how it's actually deployed, versus they just focusing on developing code.
I would imagine one of the day-to-day struggles of this would be in squashing together different disciplines, different types of people in a productive environment where they don't have a choice, where you need to be able to be constantly productive and can't be held up.
Yeah, but I mean, Reg readers have given us lots of feedback over the years about, nasty surprises. Those horrible guys over the other side of the wall have done this to us again. And the transparency thing, I think, it's about actually being able to see over the wall or through the wall or getting rid of the wall so you can actually understand what's going on the other side. So we're not necessarily talking about getting rid of disciplines here, and I think we need to make that clear. You will still have ops specialists, you will still have development gurus at the other end of the spectrum and testing experts and so on. But what we're doing is giving everyone visibility of everything upstream and downstream. And the other thing as part of that is it gives everyone a heads up as well, so you can see what's coming down the line or see what's going to come back at you from the operational environment. So that's really important.
Just on this, a very quick one that we can deal with. Mike's going to say, do Dev and Ops function as two teams or a single team? Is DevOps a DevOps team or is it a dev working with an ops?
So I've seen it done in both ways, but I mean, what's your experience, Asha?
Well, I think it's I think we have seen that in traditional applications where there is on-prem, that teams tend to be separate development teams and testing teams and operations. But we also find that in a cloud environment, for example, like there is not a separate dev and ops type of a thing. So to some extent, I think it's not there's a DevOps role. I see everybody's job is they need to understand the DevOps, and so it's not
they have
like
a clearly defined role within it.
Yeah.
But cloud's breaking down the...
It is breaking up because at the end of the day, when you develop and deploy, there's not a separate operation. So when you develop and deploy, you're already making it live in production. So the cloud is actually bringing that together. But on-prem, you tend to still see many clients having a separate dev and ops teams. And that's where the collaboration and transparency is much more important.
And there's been a parallel here. If you take people's sort of early forays into virtualization and private cloud and those kind of things, quite often you've got people that form single teams around their VMware implementation, for example. So they have actually gone to that approach. The problem with that is it's not necessarily that scalable in a larger organisation. So, as I say, this isn't about multi-skilling everyone. It's about breaking down the barriers between them. Interestingly, some of the feedback we get from smaller organisations is, so what will we do differently? Because you go to a small shop where you've got maybe less than 10 IT guys in the team. They're working as one team anyway across development and operations. So it's a fairly natural thing to do if you're in a smaller environment. But there's no right or wrong to that. It's really depends on the scale and complexity of your IT department.
Great. We do have a question in from actually a couple of questions in to talk about how we transition from traditional and how it's done practically. And we will get to that later on in this. We're coming to that very soon. Let's do 7 and 8 though first. We don't want to be distracted from this. Eliminating overhead. Yes.
Well, I think it's one of the things with the DevOps is many times it's really about you need to eliminate the number of meetings people are having, or reporting and other things, right? If you really implement the transparency and being able to have the better collaboration, I think many people think, like developers sometimes thinks that if they need to understand more about operations, I'm turning myself into an operations person. I need to carry a pager or overhead. It's not really about that. It's really enabling self-service for developers, for example, to do their job better. But overhead, it doesn't mean that they have to now take on operations role. It's about bringing that notion of operation shift left, and they still do their job better because they have better context. So to some extent, I think that overhead is really about the entire notion of pipeline, and how I'll talk a little bit later in terms of how you can look at where there is a handoffs and others. So it's the meetings, the reporting, and other aspects where people worry that if I have to deal with more number of people, that means I can't get my job done.
But specifically think that one through.
Yeah, I'd say there's also an element of trust here, because it's amazing how much paperwork and bureaucracy is in place because people don't trust each other. And you can just get rid of that lot if you streamline things and get people working together.
Yeah. And the final one, automating testing.
Yeah, I think this was an interesting one. What we found, it was one
It's
specific.
counterintuitive to me.
Yeah, so it's almost like what we found is that for those teams who are successful, because when you move to continuous delivery, one of the things what people have found is that how do I actually eliminate overhead? For example, developers who need to get the testing the solutions they're building, but you don't want them to be running all these tests and waiting for these things to done. So for one of the things what people have done is to automate some of it as part of the delivery process. So when I do my coding daily and I do the continuous integration, so being able to run those tests automatically, whether it's a security test or a static analysis or whatever, so it can automatically look at what applications I'm building, or I'm getting some feedback from the users. And that seems to be one of the key practice, which is incorporated into the continuous delivery pipeline to eliminate the overhead and the other things we just talked about.
'Cause I guess there'll be a huge amount of testing that is based, whether it's fit for purpose, whether it fits, like you say, for example, something like security, which is the user, how the users are responding to it is separate to that.
But this is about getting away from that old sort of unit testing, integration testing mindset and saying, well, we need to test it in context.
Yes.
And that's about having the test and development environments aligned with the operational environments.
Mm-hmm. So the question talked about how we get past the problem of user prejudice when you're testing on things. I guess, some of those things might be like, I preferred the old thing or something like that. Or if you are producing something and innovating very quickly, sometimes it can be hard to bring the users along with you. Is that a problem that shows up with DevOps?
Well, I think it's actually, it solves the problem better, because I think what happens is, many of the times the developers don't really know how the users are going to use and what feedback is. And also, to Dale's point, it's really out of context. If they get the feedback much later, they don't know really when they're doing coding every day and you're getting feedback on that on a daily basis or weekly basis. They understand what changes they've made and how that is impacting. And if something is, a defect, they can go back to in context to fix it sooner, versus waiting for it for a few months. And when somebody actually does this, and then you're going to try to figure out where in my code do I need to fix something. So getting that feedback from the users, as well as some of that automated testing, actually helps solve the problem.
It does, and it's a huge issue. I mean, anyone who's sort of been in project management for any time will know that user acceptance is a big point of failure with a project, and users tend not to give things a second chance. If they've written something off, it's very hard to get them to try it again. So taking this kind of stepwise approach, delivering them just enough, responding quickly if it doesn't quite, you don't get a reaction that you wanted or expected, is just so important, and it really does solve that user acceptance problem. It's plagued us for years. And
so users are much more accepting of this now. If you look at the software they've got on their phones, for example, which changes a little bit every couple of weeks. Yes.
I mean, it might be worth mentioning at this stage, we talk about daily releases or weekly releases or whatever. Just because you can do that doesn't necessarily mean that you should do that.
I was assuming that you would.
Because there are certain applications that are naturally slower moving, back office systems or whatever. But the important thing, Ashok, you were saying earlier on, it's about being ready at any moment in time to make a new release if you need to in between your scheduled release cycles.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things what most clients get worried about continuous delivery is that, can I release this every couple of weeks or daily? How will my users and my customers going to consume it, right? Because I think the thing with this is really it's about continuous delivery. Means by using this approach, it doesn't mean that you have to release software every 2 weeks or every daily. But as long as you are able to use this approach, even if you want to release at any given point, you're ready. So you can always release it, whatever your business needs based on your business goals. But by adopting the DevOps approach, you are able to release at any given point. Versus if you just go with the waterfall or regular agile, even if you want to release, you're not ready.
Okay.
Right.
Yes.
Yep.
Now let's have a look. Let's move on from this. Now, you're saying there's a tension here between optimization and innovation.
Well, I think this is actually a classic this thing in attention, because when we talk about DevOps, it's not just about development or operations, but it's really about the what we need to do from an innovation perspective. We talked about software-driven innovation. But also there is a tension, or I think what we need to do is the operations, for example, is focused on you need also optimization, right? Your systems are to be stable. They have to have issues with security, and other things have to be addressed. So how do you balance that? You want to think, release things quickly, and you manage changes, innovate rapidly, but you also have to balance that with what you need to keep things safe and in compliance, and also stable. So that's one of the tensions. I think it's increasing the demand on IT because of that.
And also then looking at this as well, if we're talking about this journey that we have that involves people, process and technology, we've already got a couple of questions in about it. People want to know, how do I actually get to that from my traditional development environment that I've got at the moment? So I mean, the last third of our hour now, I guess, then we better look at how people can start this thing going. So one of the things that you were pointing out to us, that no one's got a blank sheet of paper. You can't just walk in and say, right, from now on we're going to do DevOps and we'll just start. It's a sort of a year zero. So how do we work on adapting DevOps to fit in with the existing processes and the existing software you've got?
No, I think that's actually a very most important question, especially with enterprise clients, because people have the tendency to think DevOps is really applicable to people, companies, startups, and companies who are born on the cloud type companies, where they don't have to deal with existing systems of people or processes.
So it's not for me, DevOps, it's for those.
Yes,
yeah, those
I think
startup guys.
Exactly. So what we are finding is really, I think, many of the people we surveyed and what we ourselves are going through is to look at. It doesn't mean that just because you have existing systems you cannot do this, because what we have to do is to look at the same approach of looking at Lean and others, to look at both your existing systems as well as the new one, because there is a speed mismatch also, what we call a two-speed IT or two-speed development. So there are some rapidly moving systems like mobile and others, which you may want to deliver every week or 2 weeks or whatever, but you don't have to deliver everything that way. It's just that when there is a dependency on some of your back-end systems, those things need to get updated. Those systems need to be, or the people who are working on like a mainframe or SAP or whatever in the back end, how do you bring them along? Right, so with the DevOps approach, by focusing on the end users, getting feedback, I think you can still apply that, and I think we find many of the customers are doing this. So it's key to bring your existing systems and processes along with your rapidly moving systems.
As long as you don't break those links to the things that are going to have to stay as they are.
I think you need to prioritise, though. If you try and do that at once, particularly if you have a large IT department with lots of very complex back-end systems, heavily regulated and so on, you try and introduce this cultural change across everything in one go, it is going to be impossible to manage. So it's really a case of prioritising and choosing your battles almost. This is sort of maybe a bit of a controversial thing to say, but if you look at your talent pool, whether it's developers, operations guys, or whatever, you're going to have a usual bell curve in most organisations, where you've got the real progressive guys who, love their jobs, they live and breathe, and they really want to do everything really well at one end, and then at the other end you've got guys who are 9-to-5ers who aren't really necessarily that engaged, and a mixture in the middle. To get going, the feedback we get from lots of people is stick some of your best people onto this, onto some of the early projects in this way. Help them get some of the concepts embedded, develop some best practice, and then you can sort of gradually
and then that flows outwards, and you get the idea that success is a possible thing.
And I think this is the big difference quite often between a big IT department that has a mixture of people, for good reasons, and maybe a web startup that's been able to cherry pick some of the best engineers in the industry, and all these guys sort of come into the fold, living and breathing this stuff anyway.
Well, I made the joke that it's never year zero in this, but there is actually, if you're going to introduce DevOps in that way, then there will be a day one. So this is basically about how you get started. Now, you were saying, Ashok, that you can go online, you can basically test your suitability.
Yeah, no, I think that's the number one question when we talk about DevOps. People say, so how do I get started? Because it seems like a good thing to do, but then it also talks about people, processes, end to end, and where do I get started?
Taking people off things that they're doing already, sticking them in the DevOps team,
Yeah, so how do I do that, right? So one thing is we do have an assessment based on all the things what we learn from customers to look at how do I do a self-assessment of where we are in terms of the people, processes, and technologies, and then trying to determine what are the areas where we have the biggest bottlenecks in terms of moving to this continuous delivery. And I think that is in one area where I use the analogy of a GPS. It's almost like you, in order to decide from a business outcome, you start with that. Whether you want to focus on cycle time or you want to focus on quality and then more releases, based on the outcome. How do you then look at your existing systems and determine which areas you want to focus on? Because that is the biggest bottleneck could be your skills issues, or it could be the testing aspects. And we find deployment is an area where many people are using manual processes and things like that. So that will give you a roadmap in terms of how you want to get started. So you don't have to solve the entire problem at once, but really getting started with the biggest area of the challenge you have, and then incrementally working on those.
You can work this through yourself. You're saying that you provide an online.
There is an online. There is also DevOps adoption framework, basically which you can determine where you want to focus on. There's a community where customers share their stories and where they are focused on. So that's really something which it's we're finding.
So wherever you go to, it's the important first thing to look at where you apply your resources, and also, as Dale points out, to get some early success to create legitimacy. Yes. So, but as you also point out, inefficient delivery, that has many more implications than the first ones that we think about.
Yeah, I think one of the things when you look at what are the key challenges, patterns, what we see, why people are not able to do this. I think one is really what we find is most customers it takes 4 to 6 weeks to even make a change, because we talk about reducing the cycle time or improving the speed. When you think about most customers, if it takes 4 to 6 weeks, so how do I get to 2-week delivery? So to me, you start looking at that as one of the challenges. And the second one is really about most of the resources in many companies are working on existing things and not being able to focus on innovation. So how do I shift that to more innovative things? And then the other one is really the speed mismatch between the fast-moving systems and existing systems, and the differences between the development test environment and production. Because that's one of the fundamental reasons why some of these things fail, is because what people develop and test is a different environment than what the production is going to be. And the last one is, most customers I found we work with actually use some sort of a contractors or outsourcing providers to do some of this work. So in that context, how do you actually deal with that? How do I actually continuously deliver something and give it to the hands of the users and then get feedback? Then we actually have a normal waterfall type contracts where we have to define what a contractor is going to do. So those are some of the fundamental challenges we find customers are having in terms of getting to this continuous delivery.
There are many things that might pop up and surprise you if you don't think this through. I mean, even that one about sort of your contractors work in a particular way. This is going to be a difficult problem to solve if they can't come with you on this journey.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I think it's also worth mentioning it's not just about development. We've talked in the studio before about, for instance, modern software applications being very soft configured, as opposed you don't have to code anymore to make a change to an ERP system or CRM system. So sometimes modernizing some of the back-end systems and getting onto the latest version of whatever the package is that you're using, or even a web service, that can remove the bottleneck. So in many ways, trying to eliminate back-end development is a good way of actually enabling this process. It's all about just reducing the overhead wherever you can.
Yes, there was an issue of trust. Someone came up with, we were talking about the issue of trust. Do developers get more power for implementation, the traditional ops roles in this, or do we trust developers to put stuff live, or do ops still drive are they still got their hands on the steering wheel?
No, it's not about giving developers control of the operations environment.
Yeah.
It's about, for example, if someone in development needs to set up a new environment to do something new, if they want to recreate, well, you want them, as we said earlier on, to be working as close as possible to the live environment. Having the systems in place where they can maybe do a little bit of self-service, maybe some automated provisioning based on patterns or pre-built scripts, depending on the sophistication of your operations environment, and enabling them. So you're not allowing them to run riot over your data center at all. You're just you're removing some of the the friction between development.
I thought you said that. We just had to get it on the record, though. Definitely.
Sorry.
No, yeah, Ashok. Just talk us through this the assembly line. We've alluded to it already, but to make this explicit, this is really the key to making the thing work smoothly.
Yeah, no, I think one of the main aspects of DevOps is really think about this software delivery as very similar to manufacturing. Like if you have an assembly line in a manufacturing. So you obviously have people develop software, they build software, they test and deploy, and it gets into production. So how do you make that whole assembly line smooth and you can continuously deliver that, right? It could be 2 weeks, every daily or whatever. So in that context, I think the key thing is to understand what are the bottlenecks and which part of my assembly line is where I have the biggest problem. And then you address those things or upgrade that part of the process.
So a typical bottleneck that you see all the time would be?
Well, a lot of it is, I think I find that the testing tends to be one area because especially when I'm shipping every 2-3 weeks now, how much time do I spend time testing? And I don't have automation, I don't have the manual processes, and then the deploying in software because the developers develop software, but then they're waiting for operations teams to set up an environment for them to test it with the exact configuration what they want. And that's a big bottleneck for many customers. How do I actually automate these things, and how do I know exactly what I tested last week versus now, and what changed? I think those are the elements where we find as some of the big bottlenecks.
I think the frustration of constantly everyone's working really quickly getting this out, but yet somehow it doesn't seem to be getting out like it should do, and the response is not being built on as efficiently as it should do, so the thing just gets clogged.
Yeah, and it's creating more dependencies on each other, and now it's the waste and overhead also accumulates.
Yes, absolutely.
And we mentioned this word automation quite a bit. I mean, in very specific terms, where what we want to do is try and eliminate a lot of sort of manual scripting as much as possible, have things rules-based, patterns-based, because the problem with manual scripting is, which has traditionally driven a lot of testing, a lot of operations, is if you do want to do something differently, you have to actually, it's a lot of work to actually change what's in place.
Okay. So last 10 minutes, we've managed to get through an enormous amount. There's so much more we could talk about for this. So Dale, you're talking about some prerequisites here in terms of how you get it to work.
So some of this actually, but just to close the loop with some previous conversations we've had with the Reg readers around operations and agile operations or software-defined data center. Those kind of concepts. We talk about it from an operational point of view, but actually, a lot of what we discuss in that sense is almost a prerequisite to making sure that we don't bottleneck at the operations point of that production line. So things like, we've already mentioned providing self-service capability. So if developers and testers need to grab hold of some resource, they can do that, not just in a raw sense, but have it pre-configured in the right kind of way. Without actually filling out lots of forms and getting operations guys to spend lots of time setting it up for them. So that's enabled by automated provisioning. We've talked a lot about instrumenting your data center and for operational control, managing workloads and so on. But actually a lot of that capability can be used as part of this feedback loop, because part of the DevOps feedback is about how users are responding. The ultimate end user is responding to an application. But it's also about how the application is performing, and that physical side of things can directly come from those things that we talked about previously.
We've got 2 questions come in about this. We must make sure we cover it off. Is DevOps mostly suited to a private cloud, in-house data center environment, or is it useful when you have a hybrid cloud, for example, or you're working across many locations? Does that break DevOps?
No, actually, in fact, it helps you more, especially in a hybrid environment. What we're finding is that it's not just on the public cloud, even if you have it in the private cloud, and actually it spreads between public and private. What happens is, by looking at this as the assembly line, you can start looking at, even for example, somebody wants to develop a quick mobile or cloud app, and it may have to connect to the backend system. One way you can separate those is you can virtualize some of the backend services, and you don't have to have the dependencies. Loose coupling. We talk about loose coupling. And then other thing is, like, many people don't want to put some of their data on public cloud, for example. So in the DevOps context, you can separate some of these things. And we talked about smaller batches. How do I segregate some of the confidential data or privacy perspective onto my private instance or on-prem? And you're still able to apply that. And the feedback loop is about how do I actually get in the hands of the users in that case without actually sharing my private information of my client or whatever. So I think to some extent, I think DevOps can be, as I said, it's applying that across these 3 different tiers. And it doesn't matter really whether it's public. Public cloud helps you to maybe get it in the hands of the users much more easily than private. What we do is most of the time we think about DevOps as only the consumers, but you can actually use it for internal apps, and you can get feedback from an internal IT. You can go into the line of business and get feedback. Mm-hmm. So it's actually a very good way for them to evolve their applications internally.
Mm-hmm. Now, Praneeth, IBM, as you explain it, really tries to looks at the whole thing from one end to the other.
Yeah, I think what we found is that in the DevOps context, you really have to take an end-to-end perspective. Yeah. So you first of all, you need more like a delivery platform, like the delivery pipeline. So how do you enable that sort of a factory floor approach from all the way from ideation, where you start with understanding the requirements from users, to how do I break things into smaller batches? How do I set up my organization? How do I enable the collaboration between the development and the test organizations and the operations? And I think even in the testing, we can help them automate. And the other part is the deployment aspect. So one of the things Dale talked about was, how do I provision a test environment, which is very similar to the production environment. So you can actually create patterns based on the production environment. Mm-hmm. And then when I set up a test environment, it's based on the production environment. So we have capabilities to do that. And at the end of the day, once you build a mobile app, for example, you can actually deploy all the way over the air into the devices itself. And people could be using different devices. And how do I actually get feedback loop built in from the mobile apps or from app stores from a sentiment analysis perspective? So I think one of the fundamental other question I get on this is, do I need to get all these things from IBM? And especially many of them already have some capabilities in most companies, whether it's open source or other vendor tools and platform. So fundamentally what we have found is it doesn't have to be things from IBM. It's more like we provide an approach, and we have a standards-based way of integrating with different tools out there. But it also enables people to get the end-to-end, what does it look like, and what can I learn from it?
It's very important for your customers to think like this. And if there's a bit missing, you can provide it, but you're not saying Absolutely. You have to buy the whole. You have to buy the whole thing as a service. Just very quickly on this one, we're seeing about 1 in 3 companies you worked out are managing to do something to deliver faster.
I think the survey I mentioned, I think we actually what found is that we found that about 1/3 of those companies actually are delivering with speed, with quality, and many of them are doing it in that less than 3 weeks delivery cycle. And they may not be doing it across the company. At least some of the key projects, what they're rolling out, seem to have adopted some of these practices.
But what we're saying today is,
yes,
keep it to the places where it's most applicable, especially at the beginning. There's a few here. We don't have time to go through all of these because we've only got a couple of minutes. Is there any one of these users that you would pick out that?
Well, I think I would pick Fidelity International, which is based here in London. They actually, what they have done is to not only deliver things rapidly, and they've automated some of the things, but also they had to meet the compliance regulations. Most of the financial services companies have that challenge, right? So to me, this is really uses the approach of not only delivering fast, but also how do I actually make sure that I'm
manages the way to solve that tension
risk. So I think there are other clients, depending on, as I said, it doesn't have to be always speed. So Cars.com, for example, is focused on increasing the number of releases, because once you reduce it to a certain amount of time, if you can do daily releases, but after that what? It's more about how can I do more with less? Can I do more releases with the same number of resources? So that's, depending on the outcome they're trying to achieve. So each of the clients seem to be focused on a different aspect.
Now we can get more detail on this. IBM carries more detail. These are all public.
Yeah, we actually have case studies on each of those things, and specifically what they're trying to accomplish and what type of things that we can provide.
And remember, we've got some pretty useful links for you at the end of this. So if you get hold of the PDF for this and also follow the links, then you've got a lot more information than we can give to you now because we only have a couple of minutes. Nationwide, again, is one that you've pulled out. One great thing about DevOps, when it works, you get some great numbers from it, don't you?
No, absolutely. I think the Nationwide is a good example of this notion of having not only the fast-moving systems, but they have a mainframe, they have other applications. So how do I do DevOps in the context of when I have a mixed set of applications and different processes? So this is a good example of that. So DevOps is not limited to just on the cloud companies, but also people who have existing systems and processes. And Nationwide has a great case study of how they've done this.
Okay, so we're in our final minute. We'll just put those links up there so that anyone that's sort of stayed with us, this is your next step. Actually, some of this is pretty useful stuff, very practical. Dale, just to sum up from you, there's a question: are we getting into a world where our sort of job titles become looser and these sort of narrow ideas of exactly what we do within the IT department break down because of DevOps, or will they still remain?
No, the individual disciplines are still as important as they were before. Like all things in IT, we're going to see a bit of merging, a bit of convergence of skill sets as time goes on. But this isn't about turning everyone into a generalist. If you're a specialist today, that your role will still be important as time goes on.
And Ashok, final thing for you. In the future, is DevOps just going to be how we think about creating software? Is it going to take over the way in which we generate software within the IT department?
Well, I think so. I think it actually enables this better collaboration between, we talked always about business and IT, but I think in this case, IT becomes mission critical in the context of what line of business wants to accomplish. So it's about how do I get market share? How do I get more customers? So the DevOps puts the focus on their business's focus of users and clients. And so it's really, I think the approach is really not about just technology now, and it's about IT just being reactive versus becoming proactive, and they're now part of the business. Okay. So that's a big aspect of DevOps.
Great, guys, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Loads of questions. We hope we got through them all. I was racing to get through all of them, so I hope we did. Lots of information there, so I would recommend that you watch it again and again and tell your friends. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming along for this, and please let us know what you thought of it and if you want us to do more on this, because it's a great subject. And so from the team here and from me, Tim Phillips, goodbye.